What I'd like to do is just quickly have a show of hands. Does anyone know someone who lives in a housing cooperative? Put your hand up. Surprising. Excellent. Is anyone a member of a housing cooperative? There's a few there. Is anyone a member of another co-op or mutual organisation? Okay, interesting. You might recognise some of the brands on here, but 8 out of 10 Australians are actually members of cooperatives or mutuals of one form or another, whether that's a credit union, motoring organisations, health organisations, superannuation organisations. So brands that you see there are very common in the Australian community. Surprisingly, though, not very common in the housing community. And that's something that we're seeking to change at Common Equity, because we believe there's great value in the housing cooperative model, and there's actually lots of different types of housing cooperatives. And we'd like to get into some of those discussions today. Just very quickly, around the world, housing cooperatives are a big deal. They're very popular in different parts of the world, and in fact, in different parts, certain cities around the world, housing cooperatives make up something like 40% of the housing in particular cities. And in the Australian context, that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. We're a very rich society. There's a lot of housing pressures, and for some reason, society hasn't yet turned its mind to what are the other alternatives. We've got a very immature housing market in Australia. It's probably due to the culture and history of the Australian society, where people who wanted a house have always traditionally been able to get one. We've hit the wall 10 years ago, and that's getting worse today. There's an interesting stat there from 2012 to 2016 in Germany. They created 30,000 cooperative housing dwellings, so incredible number, and that sort of thing can happen if there's a combined effort from private sector and government to get on with solving housing challenges. I'd like to just share with you a little bit about the co-op story with a very brief video. So I love that video. It's really about sharing a little bit about the ethos of what cooperative living is all about. It doesn't talk to the model so much, and I'll come to that in a few minutes, but Common Equity was formed in 2009, and we sponsor 33 housing cooperatives across the state at the moment. Our colleagues south of the border, there's a Common Equity in Victoria. They're a much larger organisation, and they've had government support in years gone by, which has helped them grow, and they're one of the larger housing providers in the state in Victoria. We're hoping to be that model at some time in the future when people discover the benefits of cooperative living. We've got very ambitious growth plans as an organisation. We currently manage about 500 properties, and traditionally the model in Australia has been rental housing cooperatives for people on lower incomes typically. So that rental cooperative model makes up a fraction of 1% in Australia of all housing, so it's underrepresented, and the reference earlier in the video about the model being well accepted by residents is borne out by the evidence that the 2016 resident satisfaction survey across 30 housing providers in Australia, Common Equity, New South Wales was the #1 provider. So 14 different criteria. Common Equity was rated by residents as #1 in 5 out of 14 criteria, and of 13 out of 14 we're in the top 4. So we're a long way ahead of any other provider in terms of satisfaction. So once people get into a housing cooperative arrangement, they're generally very satisfied, and the fact that there's so many benefits to the model is something that we're trying to champion to all who will listen, developers, government, etc., because we believe there's some value in that model. So housing cooperatives, it sounds like there's an audience here very educated on the model already, which is great. Obviously the branch cooperative in town is well known. And I asked this question in other towns, and people know very little about housing cooperatives. They haven't traditionally been a high-profile thing in Australia, and by discussions like this, hopefully raising the profile and I guess getting that model considered as part of the housing mix is something we're very keen to do. So formal legal organisation, member-based, and I mentioned earlier about the fact that there's various models of cooperative housing around the world. In Australia, the rental model is the only thing on offer at the moment. Common Equity, in partnership with the other peak bodies in Australia for cooperative housing, are working on some new models at the moment, and they will be a mixture of shared equity and full equity models. And again, we're trying to create some diversity in the housing market by making this model available to more parts of the marketplace. The other interesting thing is, for people who don't know about housing cooperatives, it doesn't have to be share houses or hippie communal living up in the hills. That may be part of some of the history and the storytelling in years gone by, but the reality is housing cooperatives can exist across any form of housing. They can exist across any demographic, and there's no barriers to the way you can establish housing cooperatives. At the end of the day, it comes down to the residents involved being active participants and being, I guess, willing participants in the model. When you get that buy-in, the model works anywhere. So it can be freestanding houses, blocks of units. We have cooperatives in Sydney that are freestanding houses across several suburbs. People catch the bus, go across several suburbs and have their cooperative meeting, and they collectively manage their housing stock as a cooperative. So for those who aren't aware, the sorts of things that a housing cooperative might do, it's about doing repairs and maintenance on the property, collecting rent, filling vacancies that come along, record keeping, resolving disputes. So these are all activities that members volunteer their time to do, but it's about being part of a community, putting in an effort to make, I guess, a viable and functional set of working relationships. And out of that, a whole lot of magical things happen. I mentioned earlier about the resident satisfaction. Compared to other forms of housing where people are renting, typically the residents are very disempowered. You're at the mercy of the landlord about whether that leaky tap gets fixed or other maintenance items get attended to. You don't have a say in other people that are in your block. If you're in a block of units, for example, there's a whole lot of benefits of co-op housing that we're really keen to promote. That sense of community is something that really comes out in surveys when we're talking to people. It's about being part of a community, having a purpose, and I think it's come out through some of the themes earlier today and some of the speakers talking about, how can councils get traction or local communities get traction? It's all about having a sense of purpose and trying to achieve an outcome. The same is true for housing cooperatives. So having a purpose and collaborating together for an outcome gives people a sense of direction and a reason to come together to collaborate. Some other key benefits of the cooperative model is about that skill and capacity building. So the fact that in housing cooperatives people are undertaking activities for the common good requires those people to develop skills, whether you're being a chairperson of a meeting, collecting rent, resolving disputes. They're all skills that people in other forms of housing don't necessarily need to have. But the great benefit of the cooperative model is that they operate according to a set of principles, and one of those principles is that cooperatives help other cooperatives. So by being in one, you're actually part of a bigger family and network, and we've got several co-op members here who will attest to the fact that by being in that cooperative, you're not only part of your local community, you're also part of a broader network, and you can ring up people, get advice on issues. We hold regular forums where cooperatives come together, share their stories, share learning, and learn how to survive in the world, getting past some of the issues they might encounter day to day. There's some growing evidence about the health and wellbeing outcomes of being in cooperatives. Some of you might have heard the research about isolation being a very big killer for older people as they get older, and the fact that a cooperative is being a formal structure and encouraging interaction is actually excellent for your health and wellbeing, and it's an opportunity to tap into a pool of resources not funded by government that actually brings to bear some resources that helps individuals as part of the collective. Some of the benefits we'd like to champion as well about housing cooperatives is that if you're designing for cooperative living, there's actually economies to be realised in the construction pathway. So a property in a housing cooperative can look like any other property, and that's fine. You can also design housing cooperatives that optimise the use of shared space. So we've got several cooperatives across our network that have things like shared laundries and other shared facilities that actually allows developers of these properties to build slightly smaller private spaces and much larger shared spaces. And when you have a look at some, floor plans in inner city developments, for example, you can actually economise and house more people for less under a cooperative model where you're purposefully designing for shared spaces. And when you talk to people about what they like to live in, yes, most people tick off and say, I would like some shared private space. But what's really attractive is having good quality shared spaces where people can interact, and that's highly valued by residents who are part of those models. The other key point I'd like to bear out about cooperative housing is the fact that the cooperative structure is an excellent way for individuals to come together and pool resources. So while housing cooperatives do this around housing, there's lots of examples where housing cooperatives also economise and realise benefits for all of the members for other things. So that can be things like group purchasing, it can be about sharing things like motor vehicles and transport. There's a whole lot of opportunities open themselves up once you start getting together and working collaboratively with a group of other people. Again, this can be freestanding houses spread apart, or it can be in one community. So different opportunities arise depending on the type of building that a housing cooperative might operate from. But the essential point is that there are some economies and efficiencies that are realised through the cooperative model, and that's something we're keen to share not only with individuals but also with government in terms of service delivery. We have, for example, a Vietnamese seniors community in Western Sydney. They don't speak a word of English. If they were scattered within the community in public housing all over the place, they would have a very disconnected life. They would find it very hard to interact with the rest of society. We've got a small cooperative there, about 25 units. They employ a part-time interpreter, and so they're able to interact when the council writes them letters or there's events going on and they see things publicised. They can share that knowledge and learning. Interacting with the public health system and other things is very difficult for people with language barriers. As soon as one person in the cooperative works out how to navigate through, that's very efficiently shared across the group. And these are parts of the hidden economies or value that's unlocked through the cooperative model. As I mentioned before, we're working on some new cooperative models, and I think this is something that we're trying to look for opportunities going forward. There's lots of issues with the current retirement village sector, lots of complaints about the way that model works. In effect, housing cooperatives would make a better retirement village alternative than the current model that's out there. And so Common Equity is currently working on ways that could be promoted. The ethos is very similar. I ran an aged care and retirement village for a couple of years, and being part of a massive national organisation, can tell you it's very frustrating dealing with individuals who complain about local rules and regulations which they have no capacity to influence because the national body says, no, we manage thousands of retirement village homes, here's other rules, you come in on these terms and conditions, which makes no sense to me why someone can't paint their walls pink if they want to paint their walls pink. No, it's got to be the corporate colours, or, crazy rules like this, even though it's individuals' private money being invested in a retirement village unit. So we think the Australian housing market needs to broaden out and cater for the cooperative model at all different levels. I talked about shared equity, and there's some real opportunities there, I believe, for the cooperative model. If you look at the demographics, the economics of people coming through into retirement, now, started superannuation late in life, there's a whole lot of people that have saved up small to modest amounts of superannuation. When you retire and leave the workforce, you don't have enough resources behind you to buy something to secure accommodation for the rest of your life. You can't earn enough by investing it to earn a return added to your pension to pay market rent. So you're in no man's land, and there are tens of thousands of people coming through the system in the next few years, going to be in this very boat, and they're about to just queue up and join the government's welfare line to say, can you help me out, because the free market offers nothing. So from my point of view, there's a real conflict of interest. It's being borne out a bit in the Royal Commission at the moment with the banks, where someone says, well, I've got $100,000 or I've got some amount of money, it's not enough to buy a house, what do I do with it? And they say, well, look, you know, invest it in BHP shares or something else. That's actually not the best investment, in my opinion, for a whole lot of people who'd be better off finding partners who are willing to go into a shared equity arrangements that will secure their accommodation for the rest of their life, on a rental arrangement that's linked to their pension, so it remains affordable for the rest of their life. And I'd argue that the financial advice sector needs to, I guess, evolve as well to cater for other ways to add value to people in their retirement. And I haven't got the economics in front of me, but no doubt the cost avoidance compared to paying market rent would be much better than the meagre returns you would get on investing small amounts of money into term deposits or share funds. So I did also want to share the disability accommodation opportunity as well. There's a whole lot of money coming out of the federal government now for people in specialist disability accommodation. We're doing some pilot projects that are promoting the idea of a cooperative model and pooling resources and getting better bang for your buck for your care supports, but doing that to have shared accommodation arrangements where three people with a live-in carer would occupy a 4-bedroom home, and we think there's a lot of opportunity for that. And in terms of maybe local councils and regional areas, I'd urge councils who care about the economic prosperity of their regions and employment to look at getting on board with getting and facilitating some of these developments in your own council area, because it will promote lots of employment, guaranteed cash flow from the federal government for a long period of time, and it will underpin the future prosperity of your region if you're an early adopter of these things, and people with a disability have access to the services they need in an area where they can have the housing they need that suits their needs. There's also models like ground lease. So there's discussions previously and earlier on in the local government section about what do councils do with idle bits of land. Selling them off is one thing, but creating a long-term lease opportunity and a cash flow for the council, we'd argue, is probably a good opportunity as well. That makes housing more affordable to people building on those blocks without having the upfront capital outlay of an expensive piece of land, but being able to amortise that over a long period, like 40, 50 years, is something that councils may wish to have a look at. And the final model we're just having a look at the moment is developer co-ops. So the fact that developers make 20 to 30% profit margin, sorry developers if you're in the room, on doing developments, if you've got some access to resources and being able to pool those and do your own development, facilitated with an organisation like ours or engaging other development expertise, you can actually secure your own housing for 20 to 30% less on a cost recovery basis rather than paying into the profit margin of a third party. So that won't be for everyone, but there is opportunities on that front as well. So very quickly, just touch on some innovations that Common Equity is working on. At the moment, we're not looking to compete at scale and build tens of thousands of properties. We'll get there one day, but at the moment, we think the greatest value we can add is to, I guess, demonstrate some innovations and really to promote those to the sector to say, look, there should be more on offer in the housing market. I've talked about the disability accommodation, and this is the family-governed disability accommodation. So that's a world first. That's not done anywhere else on the planet. It's happening right now with pilot projects, which we're part of with another organisation called Silk, supporting independent living cooperative. And the model is working with families, representing the interests of their disabled children to articulate their needs, design accommodation that meets their needs in a location they need, in a design they need, As far as I know, everyone else building specialist disability accommodation is taking the developer approach. You build it first and then you go looking for someone that wants to occupy it. For us, we're a person-centred model. It's got to start with what is the needs of the person, and if you get that right, the location, the setup, they'll be a long-term occupant, hopefully forever, and they'll be very happy in the accommodation they're in. Shared accommodation co-op. We believe there's a great opportunity for more sharing of accommodation. It happens in the private sector. People all of the time are sharing, couch surfing, finding ways to get by one way or another. In our opinion, there needs to be more accommodation built that facilitates sharing of accommodation, and we've put an approach to the state government to try and, unlock some opportunities of public housing properties that are underutilised that need to be more fully occupied. So I think we've heard earlier references to the Bellingen Council looking at the demographics and how the demographics are changing. Housing doesn't change. Once you build it, it's pretty much set. So you've got to find a way to optimise the use of those properties, and we believe there's some opportunities with the shared accommodation model and actually building bigger houses rather than one-bedroom units. It's more economical to build a large 5 or 6 bedroom house and have some sharing occur rather than to build 5 or 6 one-bedroom self-contained apartments. So there's a niche, there's an opportunity for that. It's not for everybody, but we believe there should be some percentage of that, and we're working on some pilot projects for that. I've talked about the Vietnamese seniors. Older Single Women's Co-op is an interesting one. There was some work done which we were part of last year, but we didn't lead it. I think it was the Women's Housing Company. It may have been Shelter New South Wales, the Older Single Women's Studio Development Project. Homelessness New South Wales, I think it was. I'll get the agency right. They did some great work, and they said to people, what do you want with your housing? These are older single women. And they said, we want our own accommodation. They said, okay, that's fine. We'll just park that there. We know how to do that. If you wanted to share your accommodation, what would it look like? And they got out in a big room. They spent a couple of days with a sticky tape on the floor, and they said, well, if the room was this big and it looked that, and I had this amount of shared space and this much private space, and they drew up some floor plans and said, okay, that's great. So that was signed off and launched as a report, and everyone said, fabulous, that's a way you could deliver shared accommodation for single older people, that's great. No one's built one yet, so we thought, well, that's been a year and a half on the shelf from someone, government agency or a few different well-meaning organisations. We need to get on and build some of this stuff so you can see it. If you want to go to a retirement village and you're saying, oh, I wonder what a retirement village is like, you drive down the road and you go and look at some and you can touch it and feel it and say, yeah, I know what I like or don't like. I think part of the opportunity for solving the affordable housing crisis is actually build some demonstration projects, show people what can be done, learn from it, share the learning, and then keep moving on. So for us, we want to build one of those and show what it looks like and learn from it. We believe that if you're sharing accommodation, the co-op model is a fantastic structure because there's a formal structure wrapped around the rules and how it operates. It's not an informal structure, no way to resolve disputes, etc. It's a very good model for allowing people to interact and work together. Social housing renewal. I did briefly touch on that, which is our approach to government to build larger homes on their underutilised blocks and encourage shared housing. So that's an innovation we're promoting with government. Equity housing co-ops, we're working on some models for that. And we've got a Q&A session later so people can ask more questions if they're interested in how that might look. And we're also doing some research, which will be probably Australian first research, digging in deeply for some Australian data about housing cooperatives and the economic and social benefits, and Louise is leading that work, so she may be able to talk to you more about that. Another world first is the final dot point up there is the All Nations group. We have the world's first transgender housing cooperative. They've been in existence for a little while, and we're currently just sourcing housing for that group of people in Sydney. And it's not so much that it's a transgender group. I mean, that's great that it's the first group, and they have particular needs, healthcare, emotional needs, and also there's a marginal group that has issues with violence from neighbours and frequently in the hospital system, so particular needs about safety and security. So we're working on a cooperative set of properties that will assist them to solve a whole lot of issues. But the point of raising that here is to say, and it's picking up on an earlier point, how do you target outcomes for particular groups? And this is where I think one of the great values of the cooperative model is. You can set up cooperatives to be general, open to anybody, have cooperatives that are set up for very specific groups. It could be older single women, it could be students, it could be Vietnamese seniors. You can set up a cooperative for any purpose. So the important point about that is for local communities, if you're trying to target a particular group, you're trying to help a particular group, you can do that very efficiently through the cooperative model. It has a whole lot of rules wrapped around eligibility and who's allowed to go in, etc. So that's just worth parking there because it's one thing to build a whole lot of housing supply, but there's another thing to say, well, how do you get the right demographic in there that's actually particularly in need in a certain area, for example. Now, I'll finish up very shortly, but I did want to say that we've put together, it's a kind of publication, but there's 42 actions in here. After discussion today, I discovered the 43rd action, so this is a work in progress. And the point of this document is to say these actions are actions that local governments or local communities can take to promote affordable housing. There's lots of good ideas out there, and I thought the best thing we could do as an organisation was to package that up and treat it as like a checklist or a ready reckoner that each community can work through and say, okay, have we considered this? Yes. Is it suitable? No. Okay, move on to the next one. So it's really a way of thinking through, I guess, a collection of actions that could be undertaken locally that are all geared around promoting housing affordability. So happy to share that in detail. They're just the 9, I guess, themes, if you like, that those 42 actions come from. I've just picked out 5 examples that might be relevant to this group today. So identifying surplus government land, I think, is a very easy, quick win that councils can lead, and that means talking to state government, federal government, state government agencies, as well as the council's own portfolio, and try and flush out where's the opportunities to access land, because building new properties, that's affordable. Accessing land to actually build is actually a challenge in itself. So doing that is a nice, easy thing that can be done. Hosting stakeholder forums to broker partnerships. So this kind of event is fabulous, and I commend the organisers for doing this and the councils for their support as well. This kind of event helps broker some arrangements, because if one organisation could solve the housing affordability challenge, they would have. The problem is you need multiple organisations to solve it. They don't have the resources, the land, the skills, whatever it might be. So forums like this help bring people together, and I think that's part of the solution, is that communities rising up and actually pooling their resources and contributing to get some outcomes. I mentioned earlier about demonstration projects. There's quite a few organisations around that are doing demonstration projects. I think the City of Sydney offered one recently, block of land right in the CBD of the city, worth many millions of dollars. They've put out a tender only available to community housing providers that said, we'll give you the land for 60% below market in return for you building 100 units on it that are affordable housing and kept affordable in perpetuity. So it's one way the council's been able to facilitate a demonstration project of how you could do that kind of thing. I think this other one, which is on the back of the second one there about partnerships, I think what we need is local communities to develop an inventory of what resources are available in the community. So again, the fact that someone might have some cash, someone might have land, government agency might have some other contribution. It's about finding a way to collect those resources locally so they then can be pooled and brought into a consortium arrangement to deliver some outcomes. So from my point of view, that's a great opportunity that costs nothing other than talking to people, and you can collect this, but you need a central point, and usually an agency like a council or another, I guess, government or NGO, maybe the neighbourhood centre or the action group here could be the funnel or the focal point to collect that information. And I think education is another important but quick win that needs to be delivered, and that's because affordable housing is not about social housing. Social housing is one of the elements, but it's about accommodation for key workers. It's about accommodation in the location it needs to be. There's a whole lot of education, I believe, that needs to go in local communities to understand what it's about, because we're talking about good quality, well-designed accommodation, but affordable. So I'll pause there. Thanks for your time, and then I think there's some further discussion to follow.